deal with the regional assemblies, without whose agreement Belgium, and therefore the whole EU, was unable to sign up to free trade with Canada.
The
consultation committee just reached an agreement about the texts that reflect the Belgian position, and that is immediately being addressed to the European Commission and the Council. In the coming minutes, I'll be talking to Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker and Council President Donald Tusk. A conversation with the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is also scheduled for today.
French-speaking Wallonia led the rebellion. Critics say its leaders are playing politics to raise their profile in Belgium. They say they're sticking up for European consumers.
We in Wallonia are extremely happy that our requests have been accommodated. We've always fought for treaties which support our way of life, our environment, and which protect our public services. So nothing is set up purely to benefit individuals, but rather it's overseen by accountable public bodies which legally guarantee equal treatment.
So what is CETA? Well, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement aims to eliminate 98% of tariffs between Canada and the EU. That could save European Union exporters more than $500 million every year. Supporters say the deal would increase trade by 20% and would especially help small businesses. But critics say it gives too much power to big business. They're worried that EU regulations on product standards could be weakened, and that multinationals would be able to sue governments to get their own way. Belgium's internal deal came finally on the day when the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was due to come to Brussels to sign CETA. That trip has been postponed, and it's still not clear when the deal will finally be signed. But after a difficult week for Belgium's national government and frustration for Canada and the rest of the EU, CETA does now appear to be back on track, although there'll be no celebrating until it's finally signed. Kevin Connolly, BBC News, Brussels.
Well, I'm joined by business correspondent Tanya Beckett. Well, as we heard in that package, it's not quite a done deal yet, is it?
No, but it's a question really of putting clauses into the trade deal that appease the Wallonians and their various concerns, and also trying to persuade them that some of their concerns are not particularly valid. They centre on the fact that this is an agricultural area of Belgium. It's in the south, the French-speaking area. It's far less affluent than the Flemish north. And as I say, it's agricultural. Much of this deal is based on the idea of food products going back and forth between Canada and the EU. So that's why they felt themselves particularly exposed. They were also feeling that some of the regulations and so on that they had in place, which as far as they were concerned were a democratic matter, would really end up in the hands of multinationals, and that Canada would end up as a gateway for big US companies.
I mean, there are these type of concerns about other free trade deals with, for example, the United States as well, aren't there?
Yes, I mean, neither side has come well out of this. Canada looks a little bit inept and rather naive and rather inexperienced when it comes to diplomacy. And the EU really doesn't look in any way unified. And this, of course, doesn't bode well for the UK, which, of course, is leaving the European Union and has to negotiate its trade relationship once again. I would say there's an important distinction, though, that what we're talking about here is a change in flow of products between Canada and the EU. That's ultimately what will happen. Whereas with Brexit, what we're talking about is the EU trying to re-establish what it already has. So nobody feels particularly under threat, because if the EU gets it right, then things wouldn't particularly change.
So with the Brexit negotiations and the Brexit deal, are there other countries that may have, regions like Wallonia, that may sort of scupper those sorts of negotiations?
Well, Brussels is somewhat unique in this sense that the way that the Parliament works is that you have to have all three parts of it agreeing, and then it has to be agreed centrally. And this type of deal is described as a mixed deal, meaning that it requires the individual approval of all of the EU member states, and therefore in the case of Belgium, therefore its constituent states. That is not always the case with a trade deal. Sometimes you can get the EU to agree directly. It depends what it is and whether it contains this mixed factor, which means that it would include services too. But underlying this is a very important trend, and that is a suspicion that trade deals do not bring uniform wealth. The big figures might suggest that, but there are always those who lose out.
Tanya, fantastic to have you with us. Very, very interesting. Thank you very much. Now, Italy's Interior Minister says that it is miraculous that nobody appears to have been killed or severely injured by two powerful earthquakes which hit the region of Visoa late on Wednesday. Hundreds of people have had to leave their homes and many historic buildings have been damaged. The centre of these latest quakes is about 70 kilometres from Amatrice, where an earthquake in August killed around 300 people. James Reynolds is in the region and sent this report.
The people of central Italy have always known that they live in an earthquake zone. But the last 2 months have proven just what that means. Wednesday night's quakes have damaged roads and buildings. Rescue workers have helped people from their homes. Valentina is from the town of Visso.
We had a lot of fear and we don't know what to do right now because this is a place that lives about tourism. We don't know what to do, we don't know where to live, we don't know how to work. I don't know how we're going to start again.
The church of San Salvatore is on the tourist route. It was hit in previous quakes and it's now come down. The effects of the two earthquakes could have been so much worse. This church collapsed, but no one was hurt. And across this region, many people have avoided serious injury. They've also had to get through a series of aftershocks, including this one. Rescue workers will now have to check every road, bridge and building. One of this country's most beautiful regions is also one of its most unstable. James Reynolds, BBC News, Central Italy.
The United Nations Children's Agency, UNICEF, says that if the airstrikes on a school in Syria on Wednesday were deliberate, they were a war crime. More than 20 children and 6 teachers are reported to have been killed in the strikes in a rebel-held village in northern Syria. A residential area around the school complex was also hit. Russia has insisted it had nothing to do with the strikes. The UN's humanitarian chief said it was up to member states to act.
And it need not be like this. This is not inevitable. It's not an accident. It is the deliberate actions of one set of powerful human beings on another set of impotent, innocent human beings. And it can be stopped. But you, the Security Council, have to choose to make it stop.
Well, the former British Prime Minister and UN Special Envoy for Global Education, Gordon Brown, is at the United Nations in New York, and he joins me now. Thank you for joining us, sir. You are saying that if this is deliberate, it is a war crime, and it should be prosecuted. But how does that actually help people on the ground today?
The International Criminal Court should be brought in. We should find out what has been happening. There have been 98 school attacks in the last year and a half. We have 30 children, at least, perhaps more, who have been mutilated, who have died, and who are the victims of what is an education atrocity, which is the worst one that's happened. Now, if we don't investigate, if we don't hold people responsible, if we don't prosecute, then this will continue to happen. It's time that the United Nations Security Council said, we're putting this to the International Criminal Court.
I'll come back to the Security Council in a moment, but those ICC-type investigations and prosecutions take a long time. What does that do for people in Syria, on the ground, in Aleppo today?
Because whoever is responsible is put on notice that they're going to be investigated. They cannot do it with impunity. For too long, as Stephen O'Brien has said, the international community has stood by and innocent children in their thousands have lost their lives as a result of our failure to act. Now, what's prevented the Security Council acting in the last 2 years is Russia, and it vetoed an investigation into atrocities 2 years ago. Today, the Russian Foreign Ministry said that they would welcome an independent investigation. So in theory, all the Security Council is now in favour of investigating this crime. The Security Council should now meet. It should agree that the International Criminal Court be brought in. If it can't agree on the International Criminal Court's prosecution authority, it should agree on a separate Security Council investigation. You cannot have people bombing children in this way with impunity You have got to show that they're going to be held accountable, if possible, prosecuted by the International Criminal Court at a later date.
But isn't the core issue within the Security Council that Russia itself says that it's been threatened by NATO expansion, and some people might argue that the West has mishandled its relationship with Putin and Russia?
But hold on, this is international law. It is a war crime, agreed when we set up the International Criminal Court, that any attack on a school that is deliberate is seen as something that is a violation of human rights and has got to be both investigated, and where people are accountable, they've got to be prosecuted.
Do you think that's
this
adequate
is a clear
deterrent?
This is a clear-cut case that if there is a war crime, then people should be held responsible. Now, whether it's the Syrian army or the Russian Air Force or whoever has been responsible for this, the means exist now that Russia has said it wants an investigation for the Security Council to agree on this. We should call the Russian bluff on this and hold a Security Council meeting, agree if we can get everybody together on this. Now that Russia has said it wants an investigation, that it should happen. We have been waiting for years now to have the sort of investigations that would deter people from doing this in the future.
If people are bombing hospitals, civilians, children, is the possibility of an ICC prosecution adequate deterrent?
No, of course not. It's only one of the measures that we should be taking. But we have a year of fear because children have become the innocent victims of so many of the wars in the Middle East, and of course in Africa with Boko Haram and Sudan. We have stood by, and the international community has done so little, when schools have been militarized, when young people have been recruited into militias, and when schools themselves have been bombed. And it's time to say that this is enough and we're going to do something about it. If we do not seize this opportunity, when Russia has admitted there is a need for an investigation, to call their bluff or to force them into an investigation, then we will be failing all the children who are put in danger in future.
Well, you talk about Russia having to sort of put Russia on notice and call their bluff. President Putin saying that he's actually showing restraint at the moment, and that actually he intends to continue bombing on Aleppo and rooting out what he's called a nest of terrorists, despite the fact that there's civilians there. That's not a great deal of sway that you have over Russian actions.
I think you're missing the point. Yeah, but I think you're missing the point. There is a clear-cut case for a war crime that has been committed. The international legislation we've all approved says that if that has happened, it should go to the International Criminal Court. If we stand by when these atrocities are happening and allow children to be the innocent and vulnerable victims of wars that are being conducted in this region, then we are failing the next generation of children. If you try to sidestep the issue and say Russia did this or someone else did that or someone else is to blame, you've got to investigate a crime when it's committed. And this is a crime that we believe was intentional.
With all due respect, sir, isn't the real issue the fact that the Security Council has essentially been paralysed because of this breakdown with the relationship with Russia? And many people would argue that the West has failed in that relationship.
But hold on. I'm just pointing out that Russia stood out against the Security Council resolution in 2014. It did not support an investigation into atrocities. Now they have said, and perhaps they will regret saying this, but they have said that they would welcome and have called upon the international authorities to have an independent investigation. If we do not then follow up and have that independent investigation, then we are failing the children who have died, but failing also those children and those adults who are at risk in the future. Now, there are 6 million displaced children in Syria. There are 2 million refugee children who are now outside Syria in Lebanon, Turkey and Jordan. They are a lost generation. And if we continue to do nothing and stand by when atrocities are committed and there is a clear-cut case for an investigation, then we are responsible. But this is the moment where the Security Council could act.
OK, former British Prime Minister and UN Special Envoy for Global Education, Gordon Brown, thank you. All right, let's have a look at some of the day's other news now. And the Japanese car maker Nissan has decided to build new versions of 2 of its leading models in Britain in what is the first major deal for the industry since the UK voted to leave the European Union. Nissan's decision will secure at least 7,000 jobs. The firm said it's been given assurances that its UK-based plant would remain competitive. Twitter has announced major cutbacks after a sharp slowdown in its revenue growth. The social media giant confirmed it will shut down its short-form video sharing service Vine and axed 9% of its workforce. That is about 350 jobs. Two Yazidi women who fled the Islamic State group in Iraq have won Europe's top human rights award, the Sakharov Prize. Nadia Murad-Basi and Limia Aji Bashar were among thousands of Yazidi girls and women abducted by IS militants and forced into sexual slavery in 2014. Both survived and now the campaign for the Yazidi community. Now, with just 12 days to go until the US presidential election, the candidates are blitzing the key swing states that could decide the result. Hillary Clinton is in North Carolina, while her rival Donald Trump is further north in Ohio. He's facing criticism for taking time out of his campaign to open one of his new luxury hotels, and he's not happy about it.
I built one of the great hotels of the world. What am I supposed to do, not show up? I'm taking 1 hour off. I'm going to North Carolina right after this. Then I'm going back down to Florida. I'm going up to New Hampshire. I'm all over the place. But I can't take 1 hour off to cut a ribbon at one of the great hotels of the world. I mean, I think I'm entitled to it. She does one stop because she has no energy. She's got nothing going. She does one stop, and nobody complains about that. Nobody complains when she goes to an Adele concert all night long, while I'm making 2 speeches at rallies with, massive crowds.
Well, the BBC's Barbara Plett-Usher is in Washington. Barbara, Hillary Clinton's being joined by Michelle Obama on her campaign trail. Michelle Obama turning out to be rather the star of the show, right?
She had a real impact on the campaign, actually. The surprise star of the 2016 campaign. People really like her. She's passionate. She's seen as authentic. She's not a politician, so she doesn't have that baggage or those things to worry about, but she does carry authority. And in the speeches she's made already, she's really resonated widely. So she is a heavy hitter for Mrs. Clinton. They are going to be campaigning together for the first time. And she in particular appeals to key constituencies like millennials, like African Americans, like women. And she has been brought with Mrs. Clinton to a battleground state, North Carolina, where the race is very tight, to try and continue this Clinton effort to get out the early voters. It all depends on who actually comes to the ballot box. So the Clinton campaign is really pushing this to try and lock it in as soon as possible.
And is she managing to connect with those millennials who, for example, may have supported Bernie Sanders before?
Yeah, that's interesting because, as you said, it was Bernie Sanders who really got the millennial interest and the millennial support, and those young people weren't that keen to switch their support to Mrs. Clinton. They saw her as entitled. They saw her as part of the establishment. She wasn't radical enough. She was morally compromised. They've been flirting with independent candidates, some of them thinking they wouldn't actually vote at all. But the latest poll seems to show a reverse in that trend. Now it looks as if Mrs. Clinton, according to this poll anyway, will get as much support from millennials as President Obama did in 2012, which is considerable. And the reasons for that, according to the pollsters, were that these young people were beginning to really realize what was at stake in this election, and also beginning to realize that perhaps the independent candidates wouldn't actually be able to help them out with the issues that they wanted help on. So it looks as if she's stronger on that than she has been.
OK, so for the two candidates, less than 2 weeks to go, what are the key issues they're going to want to really hone in on?
Well, it's really all about getting the vote out now. So it's going to be the question of closing arguments. They'll make their statements probably not much different than they had before, making the case about why they're better to lead the country, pounding their candidates as such. But it's going to the focus is going to be on the ground game, making sure that the voters get out. So you have these rallies with the heavy hitters. You have them being in the battleground states. Mrs. Clinton has a much better ground game, so to speak, than Mr. Trump does, and she's really going to try and capitalize on that. Both of them still do have paths to the White House. Mr. Trump is definitely not out of the race, but she has more paths than he does, and so she's going to be trying to exploit that as well. So that's going to be the focus of the next 2 weeks.
All right, Barbara, I'm pretty sure it's going to be an exciting 12 days, if nothing else. Thank you very much. The world is facing the biggest extinction of animal life since the dinosaurs. More than 2/3 of mammals, birds, fish, reptiles and other vertebrate species will be wiped out in just 50 years. That is according to a new study which says human behaviour was eating, crowding, poisoning wildlife out of existence. Our science correspondent Rebecca Morell reports.
The world's wildlife is under threat. From African elephants, whose numbers are plummeting because of poaching, to Europe's killer whales being killed off by pollution. The Living Planet report looked at 3,700 different species, and it's found that since 1970, populations have fallen by nearly 60%. That's a decline of about 2% every year.
Extinction is actually a natural process, but we are seeing higher levels of extinction than is naturally predicted. So we are already seeing extinctions, but yes, we would expect those extinctions only to increase if we don't stop these population declines.
But it's animals found in rivers, lakes and wetlands that are suffering the biggest losses. Populations of European eels have collapsed, while the range of the Ganges River dolphin has dramatically reduced. And for amphibians, 1 in 3 species is now under threat of extinction. The researchers say that humans are to blame, from overfishing to deforestation and climate change. They warn if nothing is done, wildlife populations could fall by 2/3 by 2020. But some conservationists say the way the data's presented doesn't give the full story.
So it's true that the overall index is declining very markedly, but of course it's an overall measure that's aggregated up from many different cases, and it hides some really important differences between species, between different parts of the world, and between different habitats.
But amid the declines, there have been some successes. Wild tiger numbers have now risen for the first time in a century, and giant pandas are now no longer classified as endangered. But it will be a challenge to reverse a problem that's on such a large scale. Rebecca Morel, BBC News.
The president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, has offered a 40% rise in the minimum wage. It's the 4th increment this year. Now, this comes a day after hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets to protest against the government. The oil-rich country is facing widespread food shortages and spiralling inflation. The mass demonstrations came after a recall referendum process. An attempt to remove Mr. Maduro from power was suspended. More than 1 million people in China have signed a petition demanding that a captive polar bear be relocated. The animal, which is kept in a small enclosure in a shopping mall, has been described as the world's saddest bear. Animal rights groups have released a video of the creature in the southern Chinese city of Guangzhou. They say it's displaying signs of agitation. The shopping mall is refusing to give up the bear, saying it's not breaking Chinese law. Just quickly, time to remind you of our main story. Belgian officials say they have reached a breakthrough on a European Union free trade deal with Canada. The Belgian Prime Minister said the heads of his country's regional and linguistic communities had now agreed a revised text. Now, the agreement was due to have been signed today, but it was delayed by opposition from the region of Wallonia. Do remember you can find out more on the US election. Just go to our website, bbc.com/news. You can find updates there from all our teams following their campaigns, a Daily Dig roundup, and there's also a poll tracker showing you who's ahead in the opinion polls, how Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton have performed over the last month, and pretty much anything else you want to know about the elections there. And of course, you can get in touch with me and most of our team on Twitter. I am at Lebu_Diseko. I'd love to hear from you. And of course, you can see what we're working on via Facebook as well. Facebook.com/BBC World News. Lots there to look at about our programmes as well. Coming up in the next few hours. Thanks for watching BBC World News.